Good morning and welcome to Lesson 2 of the Witch Hunting Early Modern Europe Transition Unit for Year 11 students who've chosen to take A-Level History. This lesson is going to focus on the impact of the Reformation on the growth of witch hunting in early modern Europe. Reformation, again, if you've studied the Crime and Punishment Unit, or if you've studied the Elizabeth Unit or the Henry Unit, or the Medicine Through Time Unit, you're going to have an understanding and an idea about the consequences of the Reformation and what the Reformation was. We're going to relate that to witch hunting today and just explore the idea of, was this a cause of the witch hunting? Did the Reformation and the changes caused by the Reformation lead to a growth in witch hunting or not? And it is an area that's debated quite extensively amongst historians, and hopefully your reading from last lesson on the background and the timeline of the Reformation will help you to understand this. The image we've got, the kind of quite gory image that we've got in the background, is a painting of the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, which took place in France in 1572 and was an attack on French Protestants by their Catholic enemies. I'm just throwing up here to kind of emphasise that the changes caused by the Reformation were at times quite bloody and violent and brutal because of the extent of religious tensions in Europe that were created by the Reformation. Whether or not the Reformation manifested itself in violent witch hunting is something that's more debatable. We'll come into that later on in the lesson as well. So a bit of context here, a bit of background. You've got an image there of Martin Luther, credited with kickstarting the Reformation. We're looking at the question, how did changes in religious attitudes and practices encourage the growth of witch hunting? It appears at first sight that there is a causal link between the development of the Reformation and the development of witch hunting. The period where the main conflicts and changes of the Reformation took place between 1520 and 1650. Since those years include the period where witch hunting was most intense, namely late 16th, early 17th century, some historians, people like Hugh Trevor Roper, have argued in the past, assumed that the Reformation was a catalyst for witch hunting, or the religious tensions that the Reformation exacerbated led to an increase in witch hunting. Other historians have argued the opposite. They've said that this is a bit superficial and not really borne out by the facts and the detail when we look at witch hunting in particular areas. Brian Levac, who is an excellent historian of the witch hunts and who most of the material in these lectures is based on, there's a link to his website in the folder where these lessons are found. He argues that this is unlikely, and the points that he gives below are quite useful in explaining why. Number one, in terms of chronology, the European witch hunt actually began almost 100 years before Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses and kickstarted the witch hunts. So it doesn't quite fit in with this age of Reformation / age of witch hunting argument, and the synthesis that some historians have drawn there. Equally, during the early years of the Reformation, so 1520 to 1550, there were relatively few witchcraft prosecutions in Europe. The really intense period of witch hunting in Europe is in the latter part of that century, and the earlier part, in the first half at least, of the 1600s. So we might argue, and we might argue with some justification, that if the change of the Reformation was the catalyst, we might expect a sharper increase in witch hunting during the earlier years of the Reformation. So that's Levac's view on this, and we'll go through and we'll explore that a little bit more depth now. There were some changes, though, that happened as a result of the Reformation that certainly did influence the witch hunts and influence the increase in witch hunting. Number one is an increased fear of the devil and the devil's work in in Europe and the devil's role in corrupting people and turning them against the true religion or the true faith. And I think it's worth arguing, it's reasonable to argue that Europeans increased their awareness of the devil's presence in the world, and became more determined to wage war against it. And you see this in the Reformation, and you see it in what's called the Counter-Reformation as well, where Catholic powers in Europe went about trying to stem the flow of the Reformation, stem the tide of Protestantism in various different countries in Europe. It goes back to this view of the devil in early modern society that we touched on in the last lesson, whereby Satan presents both physical and spiritual danger by Christendom, by either causing physical harm or, perhaps more worryingly, corrupting people and turning their back on Christ. And it's easy to see in the context of Reformation, where people are changing religion, why those religious changes could be attributed to a demonic, evil, malevolent presence, and why that would increase people's fear of the devil and their belief that he is a more active presence in Christian society. And it's also worth pointing out that in terms of causing physical and spiritual danger, they are the crimes that witches are supposedly guilty of. Causing physical harm through magic, and they get that magical power after having first made a pact with the devil. Once you proceed on the grounds that the devil is real and he does pose a threat to Christian communities in Europe, it's natural that educated or powerful people will try to put a stop to that threat, try and put a stop to that danger. They did this in several ways. Number one, by trying to live in godly, morally pure societies, and upholding Christian standards of morality. It's interesting when we will come to look at victims of witchcraft, and the people that were accused of being witches, the instances where people were accused because they didn't conform to normal Christian standards of morality, and that was something, or that was a factor that made them become singled out and accused. But these elites in society also waged war against the devil, not only by trying to maintain moral standards and Christian standards, but also, and perhaps more importantly, by prosecuting witches. And you can see an illustration here of this on the right, painting by Michelangelo, of the Archangel Gabriel defeating Satan's armies. Biblical image here. It shows that people in the Renaissance or Reformation period were aware of this conflict between good and evil, and this battle that was being waged between Satan and Christianity in Europe. And we've explored the links between that conflict and Christianity as well. Personal behaviour and emotions of guilt, and the sacrament of confession is also something that's extremely important in witchcraft and witch hunting and the trials of the witch hunts. Both Protestant and Catholic preachers constantly encourage their followers to lead an exemplary moral life. It's worth bearing in mind the context of early modern Europe, and the reality of heaven and hell to the people that were alive at that time. Hell and heaven were real places, and if you wanted to gain your place in heaven, that was your responsibility. It was your responsibility to live a Christian, godly, moral life, if you wanted to gain a place in heaven after you died. And the adverse of that is true. If you lived a sinful life, there was a rather severe punishment for that after you eventually died. Religious reformers encouraged moral conformity and instructed people to live a more morally rigorous life. You see this in probably the most extreme example of Puritan Protestants leaving England and travelling to America to set up quite isolated but very strict religious communities where they thought they could exclude outside influences and corruptions and just live this godly existence. Interestingly, Salem, which was one of those communities, also has a very famous, notable and intense witch hunt, which also also serves to underline this link between behaviour and guilt and witch hunting. And the common belief and how this links all into witchcraft was that an individual was responsible for their own salvation, and that led people to be very concerned with their own sinful behaviour. People who failed to meet the very demanding standards of moral behaviour often felt huge feelings of guilt and failure for not doing so. And this idea of guilt transference is also going to be very important when we come to selecting witches. On the right hand side in this image, you've got a kind of stereotype of the witch, the most common stereotype, I suppose, as a kind of old woman. A historian called McFarlane has used this idea of Christian feelings of guilt and this idea of guilt transference, putting your own feelings of guilt onto somebody else, to help to explain who was selected as witches, who was accused of being witches in England. And the structure he follows is laid out here in these bullet points. There's a kind of common scenario that occurs in witchcraft accusations. Namely, an elderly woman is dependent on charity and asks her neighbours for help. Women at this time are often much more dependent on husbands as a wage earner or breadwinner. So widows, financially or economically, were very vulnerable in village communities. And also even some younger women, if you think of the frequency of warfare, plagues, famines, there's lots of opportunity for death and for people to become widows at this time. But in the farm's one, the elderly woman is dependent on charity, asks her neighbours for help, the neighbour refuses, and as in inverted commas, kind of good Christian, feels incredibly guilty for refusing charity to a vulnerable person. They get rid of their guilty feelings, or they transfer their guilty feelings by accusing the woman of being a witch, who would naturally, if they were a witch, would not deserve any Christian charity. This was often justified if the elderly woman happened to mutter or curse at the neighbour after her request for charity was refused. And this idea of language or outspokenness can be quite important in witchcraft accusations. Witches often were not simply women, but kind of assertive or people who were seen as being upstart women. And this is something that McFarlane picks out in his model of how people were accused of witchcraft. This is because, and the reason why this curse is important, is because any subsequent misfortune that the neighbour might suffer could be blamed on the old woman's curse and used as evidence they were capable of performing harmful magic. So you've got this model of somebody asking for charity, that charity being refused, the refuser feeling guilty, and to get rid of their feelings of guilt, they interpret any subsequent misfortune they might suffer onto the person who they refuse to give help to. And over time, this could lead to a reputation of that person being someone sinister or suspicious or potentially a witch. And it just goes back to this idea of, during the Reformation, ideas of guilt and moral conformity and the need to be as kind of Christian as possible, whether that's Protestant or Catholic Christian, were very important indeed. Religious conflict is another area, or another consequence, I should say rather, of the Reformation. Reformation and Counter-Reformation led to several bitter conflicts between Protestants and Catholics throughout Europe. You can see on the right hand side just a rough sketch of a map of Europe in 1660, and where different Christian denominations are found. You can see the majority of Europe is still remains Catholic, with the Eastern Orthodox Church based in Greece and Russia. Calvinist and Lutheran are forms of Protestant churches, so you can see where they're dotted about in Europe. The role of these religious conflicts in encouraging witch hunting is less direct than many historians would argue. There was a kind of view, and it's quite an easy view to understand, that the witch hunts were Catholic people accusing Protestants of being heretics and witches, and Protestants accusing Catholics of being heretics and witches, and that was where this witch craze sprung up from, and that's why the Reformation was so important. There's no specific link to say that Catholics hunted witches more intensely than Protestants hunted witches. Witch hunting most intense in places like Germany, Switzerland, France, Scotland. Some of those are Catholic, some of those countries are Protestant, so it's not a simple matter of one religious group hunted witches more proactively than another religious group. It's also, and I'm just seeing if I can, I'm going to go to this now. It would also be quite easy to assume that in states where there is more than one religion, or where more than one religion is practiced, such as a state where Catholic people and Protestant people both practice their religion, that this would be a key cause of witchcraft prosecutions. The common assumption being that people accused other people of being witches because they practiced a different religion. So as I was mentioning before, Catholics accusing Protestants, Protestants accusing Catholics. It's not something that is borne out in the actual trial records of the witch hunts. In most areas, the person accused of witchcraft belonged to the same religious group as the person accusing them. The initial accusation in a witchcraft trial comes from villagers accusing other villagers, or people accusing their neighbours, or people that they know very closely of being witches. And at a village level, there wasn't an awful lot of religious diversity. Even if there was diversity within the country or the state as a whole, at a kind of village level, it wasn't necessarily like that. So that's the main criticism of this, one religious group accusing another religious group of being witches. It's also sometimes argued that conflicts such as the 30 Years' War led to a rise in accusations of witchcraft. There is an argument there. Some historians put a lot of weight behind this argument because they say that religion causes death. It increases the number of widows and dependent women who become dependent on charity. It leads to shortages of food and resources that increase tension between neighbours at a village level. It leads to a climate of fear, and it leads to the search for scapegoats and people to blame. And all of those things can manifest themselves in witchcraft accusations. And if you look at something like witch hunting in England, in East Anglia, for example, during the English Civil War, you can certainly trace a link between warfare and an increase in witch hunting. But it's probably not. It's probably too far to say that these conflicts directly lead to an increase in witch hunting. Brian Novak argues that the opposite is true, and he argues that warfare actually stopped the legal system in whatever area was experiencing conflict. It stopped the legal system working, and the legal system was needed to prosecute witches. And actually, if you look at, for example, Matthew Hopkins in England operating during the English Civil War, Matthew Hopkins is able to prosecute witches so extensively because the normal legal system breaks down. So he's a kind of exception to this rule. But the key thing to remember is it's the legal system and how well that can operate that leads to an increase in witch hunting. In England, the legal system was quite restrained, and it was more difficult to prosecute witches under the English legal system, which is why when warfare breaks down that system, you get an increase in witch hunting. In other areas, for example, parts of Germany or the Holy Roman Empire, the legal system was very geared towards encouraging prosecutions for witchcraft. So when warfare came to those areas and the legal system broke down, the number of witchcraft prosecutions declined. The argument that I put forward just a moment ago, that hardships and difficulties such as shortages of food were blamed on witches, there's an element of that, but equally people in the early modern period were not stupid, and if their crops had been destroyed by an invading army, they blamed the invading army. They wouldn't blame, the sort of loudmouth, defiant, difficult person who lives a couple of houses down from them. They could see what was obvious in front of them. So I suppose as a conclusion here, going back to the slide of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that we started this lecture with, the Reformation did lead to religious conflict and violence, such as the St. Bartholomew Day massacre shows. But it's probably too much of a stretch to say that the Reformation was a direct cause of the witch hunt by itself. And when you think about causation as a historian, you have some causes which are sufficient and some causes which are necessary. A sufficient cause is a cause that's so important that this cause by itself can make another event happen. And I think it's too much of a stretch to say that the Reformation by itself caused the witch hunts to happen. Other factors also needed to be present for the witch hunts to occur when they did. Other factors are necessary. What this means is this factor had to be present in order for the witch hunts to take place, but other factors also had to be present at the same time. It wasn't enough for this factor to cause an event by itself. It's up to you, and we'll do a little bit more research in this when we look at the work of historians, to decide whether the Reformation was a necessary factor or whether the witch hunts could have occurred at this time had the Reformation not taken place first. And that's when you start to really start thinking about causation and factors at history in quite a sophisticated way. But that's not something I'm going to go into now, because you'll do plenty of work on causation and evaluating interpretations later on. But it's something to start thinking about, especially when you start looking at the tasks that are related to this topic, and when we feed back and we look at intellectual causes and legal causes later on in the course as well. So that's religious conflicts and the Reformation and the impact on witchcraft finished. Hope you enjoyed the lecture. Take some time to read through the notes, take some time to complete the tasks, and I will pick up the story in the third lesson. Thanks very much.